Greetings and welcome to the another episode of Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. We are honored to welcome Professor Peter Lamont, Professor of Psychology at the School of Philosophy, Psychology and Language Sciences at the University of Edinburgh, UK, as our distinguished guest on today's podcast episode. Dr. Peter studied history at the University of Edinburgh before completing a PhD focused on Victorian beliefs about spiritualism. Since joining the Hessler Parapsychology Unit in 1996, he has developed an academic career that bridges psychology, history, and the study of extraordinary beliefs. From 2002 to 2005, Professor Lamont held a prestigious Art and Humanities Research Council fellowship and was appointed lecturer in psychology in 2006. His research explores the intersections of belief, critical thinking, the history of psychological thought, and the culture context of magic and paranormal. He is the author of several influential publications, including Extraordinary Beliefs, a historical approach to a psychological problem, published by Cambridge University Press, and articles in journals such as History of Psychology, Journal of Social History, and Review of Journal Psychology. Professor Lamont is a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy and a member of the British Psychological Society, where he previously served as a secretary of the History and Philosophy section. He is also a member of the Society for Psychical Research and associate of the Inner Magic Circle, and a former president and honorary member of the Edinburgh Magic Circle. In addition to reviewing for numerous academic journals, he is the co-founder of the Edinburgh Secret Society, although naturally he can't say too much about that. In this episode, Professor Peter Lamont offers thought-provoking insights from his acclaimed book, Radical Thinking, How to See the Bigger Picture. So without further delay, let's welcome Professor Peter Lamont to the podcast. Thank you, Professor Peter, for graciously accepting our invitation and joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Professor Lamont, your book encourages us to think beyond our immediate perspectives. What inspired you to write Radical Thinking and why now?
Well, a few years ago, it became obvious that we need critical thinking more than ever. And so in 2019, I created a critical thinking course at the University of Edinburgh. And it was based on the idea, a very simple idea, that before you can think critically, you need to be curious about the world. And so it was all about making students more curious about the world in which they live. And it was a very popular course. But then we had a global pandemic and I couldn't teach the course anymore. And so that's when it became a book.
You describe radical thinking not as a fixed method, but as a mindset driven by curiosity. How do you define radical thinking in contrast to conventional critical thinking?
Well, critical thinking is supposed to be about how you think, not what you think. So whatever you think, it's not about where you end up. It's about how you get there. But what happened in the 20th century is that critical thinking became increasingly about where you end up, and especially about getting it right. And so there was a growing focus on fallacies and biases that lead us to get it wrong. And I wanted to get away from this focus on getting it right or wrong and focus on the process rather than the outcome. So wherever we end up, the question is, how do we get there? And that's radical, from the Latin radic, meaning root. Radical thinking is thinking about the roots, the foundations of what we believe.
Professor Peter, your book explores how our belief, assumptions, and desires shape our worldview. Could you share an example, perhaps from history or a daily life, where these hidden forces profoundly influence perception?
Well, we could start at the beginning. For example, whatever we think about any subject is based on what we notice. Because if we don't notice something, it won't cross our minds. However, we notice a fraction of what's going on. So even right now, as I tell you, you notice a fraction of what's going on. You're noticing a fraction of what's going on. So now, as you're listening to this, you're ignoring the walls of the room and the floor beneath your feet, the chair that you're sitting in, the fact that you're breathing. All these things are there right now, but you're ignoring them, or you were ignoring them until I mentioned them, and now you're more aware of them. Because what we notice depends on where we direct our attention. So that's one of the ways our view of the world is shaped by things that we don't see because they're not out there, they're in the ways that we actually look at the world.
You draw from an eclectic mix of sources, local anecdotes, history, and even Sherlock Holmes. What role do stories and cultural references play in helping us rethink how we think?
Yeah, it's easy to just tell people this is how you think, these are the things that shape your thoughts. But if you can find a story or a joke or a quirky bit of history that illustrates the point, then people can listen and then see it for themselves. And this is why we love stories. We find them interesting and they tell us something about ourselves. So, the example I just gave about what we notice, the idea is you don't just hear the information, but you become more aware of what you're missing and see it for yourself.
As a former musician, how has your experience with illusion and misdirection informed your understanding of human cognition and beliefs?
Well, as a magician, you're dealing with cognition and belief, not in the laboratory, but in the real world. You need to convince a live audience that something impossible is happening. So you need to understand not just where they're looking, but also what they're thinking. For example, if they don't believe the coin is actually in your hand, they won't be impressed when it disappears. So to be a good magician, you need to understand how people think.
In today's world of misinformation and competing narratives, how can radical thinking help us navigate what's true, what's not, and what lies in between?
Well, it starts by being aware of the limits of your own view. So, for example, what we think is based on what we notice, but also how we interpret that. And people notice different things and they interpret them in different ways. And so we end up with different views of the world. And of course, everyone thinks that what they think is true. That's why they think it. But what we can do is we can understand different points of view, which help us to see the bigger picture beyond our own limited view. And when we encounter a particular claim, we can think about the foundations of that claim and we can ask some questions. First question, what precisely are they saying? Now that sounds obvious, but it's not because we constantly disagree about things and we're actually arguing about slightly different things and we talk past each other. So that's the first question. Then, once we know what we're actually talking about, we can ask, well, what's the evidence for that? And evidence, of course, is crucial. But until we understand the actual claim, we don't know what it's evidence of. And then there's a third question, which we often forget, which is why are they telling us this? Because even if it's true, there are countless things that are true. So, why, of all the things they might tell us, are they telling us this? And of course, it's not always about the truth. It might be to change the subject or to distract us from something else. So, despite all the confusion and uncertainty, there are things that we can do to make sense of what's going on.
Professor Peter, you emphasize that the goal of radical thinking is not to be right, but to broaden our perspective. How can we cultivate this approach in our daily lives, especially when we are conditioned to seek certainty?
Well, I think we need to realize that whatever we think, we can't be certain, and we might be wrong. Even in science, scientific knowledge is based on data, which is always limited and always needs to be interpreted. So if there's new data or a better theory comes along, then scientists need to change their mind. And outside the laboratory, of course, the real world is messier. So we need to recognize the limits of our own view. Now, one simple thing we can do is remember something that we used to think, but we don't think it anymore. Or something we now think and ask, well, what would it take to change our minds? So I've studied the paranormal for more than 25 years. I don't believe in the paranormal. But if I ask myself, what would it take to change my mind? I don't have an easy answer. And when we remember that we might be wrong, I think that breeds a bit more humility. And I think that's probably a good thing.
Insightful. The book seems to gently challenge readers rather than confront them. Was it a conscious decision to make radical thinking more accessible and less confrontational?
Yeah, confrontation is a large part of the problem. When you tell people they're wrong, they tend to find that annoying. And quite right, because it's kind of arrogant. And when you realize that whatever you think, you can't be certain, it makes no sense. You might be wrong, they might be right. And if you want to change their mind, well, you first need to understand their point of view. And the only way to do that is to listen to them. So confrontation is not the way.
Dr. Peter, your affiliations from the British Psychological Society to the Inner Magic Circle spans both science and mystery. How do these worlds complement each other in your approach to understanding thought and beliefs?
Well, it's useful to have different approaches because there's no one way to make sense of the world. Psychologists, magicians, historians, philosophers, they have different aims. They ask different questions and they answer them in different ways. So the more perspectives you have, the better chance of seeing the bigger picture.
Professor Peter, my last question. For our listeners who are curious but perhaps skeptical, what's one simple step they can take today to begin thinking more radically and seeing the bigger picture?
Well, skepticism is good. Whenever we hear something, we should be skeptical. And when we hear something that makes us skeptical, that's because it's something that we don't take for granted. And that's a good thing because that reminds us there are things that we take for granted. And when do we ever notice the things that we take for granted? So there's one thing. Next time you hear something that makes you skeptical, instead of looking for reasons why you disagree, ask yourself, what exactly is making you skeptical? What are the things that you take for granted that this is challenging? Because that's the thing about alternative views. They can be useful. They can help us to see the foundations of our own beliefs. And that helps us to see the bigger picture beyond our own particular view.
Listeners, if today's conversation sparked new questions or shifted your perspective even slightly, I encourage you to dive into the book Radical Thinking. It's not just a guide, it's an invitation to see the world with fresh eyes. Thank you, Professor Peter Lamont, for joining us and sharing your fascinating insights from radical thinking, how to see the bigger picture. Your unique blend of psychology, history, and touch of magic has truly expanded the way we understand how our mind works and how we can begin to think more curiously, more openly, and yes, more radically. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Deepak.